Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 99 of the Feeling Good podcast. Today we'll be broadcasting an interview of David with Lisa Nicole Bell on her podcast Behind the Brilliance, which she produces from Los Angeles. And for those of you interested in discovering more of her work, we'll have a link to her website in the show notes. And today, this is another opportunity to hear different voices and a different set of questions than the same old ones that I tend to ask David. Lisa tailors her interview to her podcast audience, and her show delivers a smart and funny take on pursuing ambitions, designing a life, living joyfully. And she interviews smart and creative people about their lives and their work. She has earned a variety of nominations and awards in media and in business. She previously earned an NAACP Theater Award nomination for the stage play Deal Breakers, which she wrote, directed, co-starred in, and co-produced. She has directed and produced documentaries on race and identity, diversity among young entrepreneurs, women issues, and is now in pre-production on a new series that she is executive producing with Academy Award winning actress Viola Davis. Lisa is the author of Divine Inspirations and a contributor to books such as End Sex Trafficking and The Path Redefined. She will be asking today some questions of David's about how he approaches perfectionism, depression, and anxiety with his patients, and the joys of a life free from the need to be special, and much, much more. Let's hear it.
David, I am so excited to have you on the show. Welcome to Behind the Brilliance.
Well, I'm flattered to be on your show, and I'm excited. Thank you.
There's so many things I want to talk to you about because I have to tell you and tell the listeners that your work, in particular, Feeling Good, your book, has been transformative for me personally, and I have gifted it to so many people. So I'm super excited to dive into that part. But I want to start with how you got into the mental health field, because it's generally not one of those things that a fifth grader says, I'm going to grow up and fix people's emotional and mental problems.
Yeah, right.
Tell me about your path.
Well, I was a philosophy major at Amherst College, and I was trying to find out, what I should do with my life. So they had this interest test you could take to find out if your interests were similar to some other profession. So they could say, oh, you'd be good as an artist or a high school teacher or whatever. So I took this test, and then they interpreted it for me, and they said, David, you're interested in everything. There's only one profession you must avoid. And I said, what's that? And they said, medicine. You're not at all like a doctor, and you'd be very unhappy if you went to medical school. And I said, don't worry, that's the last thing in the world I'd ever want to be as a doctor. I mean, I had a blood phobia, and I was just I wasn't a pre-med or anything. But then my senior year, I read a book by Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher. It was called Philosophical Investigations, and one of my roommates turned me on to it. And he said, oh, you should read this book by Wittgenstein because it's rumored that only 7 people in the world can understand it, but it contains all the solutions to all the problems of philosophy. And if you write your honors thesis on it, your senior, honors paper, when you have to defend it to the faculty, they probably don't understand it, so they won't be able to challenge you. So I thought, that sounds good. So I started reading this book, Philosophical Investigations, and it was English on one page and in German, I think, on the other page. And it was about real simple things, like it starts out with this paragraph about this bricklayer. He's making a wall, and he has an apprentice, and he shouts to the apprentice, "Brick," and then the apprentice brings him a brick to put in the wall. And then he says, "Now do you understand the mistake that Aristotle made?" And I'm thinking, not particularly. I don't know what you're talking about. And then he'd have another little like paragraph about string, or what's common to all games. Is there anything that's common to all games? Well, it's not a ball, because chess has no ball, and on and on. These things. They'd say, "Now do you understand the solution to the free will problem?" And I would say, "What does that have to do with a piece of string?" And I couldn't understand it. And then my senior year, I was walking across the Amherst campus, and it suddenly hit me like lightning what he was trying to say. And it was so simple, it's why I hadn't been able to get it. And I suddenly understood the solution to all the problems of philosophy that I'd been so interested in.
Wow.
And I said, "Wow, there's no reason to go on to graduate school in philosophy," which is what I had kind of reconciled myself to doing. So what should I do? I think I'll be a psychologist, I thought, because that's like philosophy, but it's practical, and you can help people with their mood problems and stuff like that. So I told my advisor, I think I'm going to switch and go to psychology graduate school instead. And he says, "Oh, no, that's no good. You have to go to medical school." I said, "Medical school? Why would I want to go to medical school? I'm not even a pre-med student." And he says, "Well, psychiatry is like psychology, but you can prescribe drugs. And drugs are going to become so important in the future. So you've got to go to medical school instead of psychology graduate school." And I said, "But I'm not a pre-medical student. I've never even had a biology class. No way I could get into medical school." And he says, "Don't worry." He says, "You can talk your way into anything. They won't even notice that you haven't taken any of the required courses." So I said, "Okay." And I actually talked my way into the Stanford Medical School. I used some kind of deceptive tactics when I was interviewed, and it worked very well.
Wow.
And so I ended up in medical school, but I think I was just about the worst. Well, I won't be narcissistic to say the worst, but one of the worst students they ever had at Stanford Medical School. But I managed to graduate, and then ended up doing a psychiatric residency. And now I'm just as happy as can be. I've had just a fantastic career. But the irony is I started out in biological psychiatry, prescribing drugs, the very thing that I had been the opposite of what my inclination was. And then when I saw that all the drugs weren't doing it for people, I decided to focus on psychotherapy. And what was new then in the 70s was cognitive therapy. And there was a weekly seminar on it, and it sounded like quackery to me. But I decided to go and try it out with my toughest patients just to prove that it wouldn't work. And it did work. And so I gave up a career at University of Pennsylvania Medical School, a full-time career doing brain research and drug prescribing, and went into clinical practice instead, and decided to help develop cognitive therapy. And it's just been a fabulous adventure, and a decision that was hard to make at the time, but one I've never regretted.
Absolutely. Yeah. It feels like the career fits you like a hand in glove. You can tell when someone's doing something that is very tied to their purpose in life. So I would imagine that, your movement away from the drugs, exploring these other disciplines, led to the birth of the book Feeling Good, which has been sold more than 4 million times. Is that right?
Well, it's over 5 million now in the U.S., and it's over 30 languages that it's been worldwide that has been translated into. Yes, the Feeling Good. When I started going to this seminar, Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy weekly seminar at Penn, I would present my toughest cases. There were only about 5 or 6 cognitive therapists in the world at that time. We were all there in Beck's weekly seminar. It was kind of an unknown thing at the time. And then I got so excited when I learned these fairly simple tools that were transforming the lives of my patients. it was remarkable to me. And then Beck said, do you want to be a co-author? We have to have a textbook on cognitive therapy for therapists. Do you want to, add a chapter or, be included? And I said, I don't think so. I said, you've got several people here who can be co-authors on that book, but I think we need a textbook for the general public, for something that patients can read between sessions to accelerate their progress. And I think I'd be excited to write that book. And that's kind of how it got started. And when the book was published, it was very hard to get a publisher. It was incredibly difficult because everyone thought a book on depression nobody would want it.
Oh, that's really interesting. Why do you think that is? I mean, I think given my limited knowledge of the field of mental health and self-help at that time, I know it wasn't as readily accepted as it is now, and we didn't have all of this like pop culture woven into self-help. But if depression was still a concern for many people, it would seem that it would present a huge opportunity for a publisher because there weren't many books like it on the market at the time.
Yeah, well, the publishing business isn't very scientific, and they kind of go on impulse. And see, I'd never met my agent. He was someone who sent a postcard to Beck saying, if you know anyone who wants to write a book on depression, I'd like to be the agent. And so Beck handed it to me one day. He said, I got this in the mail. I don't know who this guy is. And since I was working on a book, I contacted him, signed a contract to give him 10% of the royalties. And he said, well, you have to write the whole book before I can give it to a publisher. And I didn't know anything about popular writing. So to tell you the truth, it was kind of boring sounding. The title of it was Mood Therapy. I think was something like that. Yeah. The New Approach to Feeling Good. That was the original title of the book. And it was fairly intellectual. And so he gave it out to 6 publishers. I made 6 copies of this draft, and nothing happened for 6 months. And I was very uneasy, and I kept saying to him, why isn't anyone responding? He says, oh, this is great. They haven't rejected it. No news is the best thing in the world. And it just didn't seem right to me because I figured it was just sitting on the floor somewhere and, under a pile of unread manuscripts. And I had a patient who was doing book reviews for the radio, and I told him, I said, I'm kind of anxious. And he says, well, that agent that you've got is not, I shouldn't be disrespectful, but he said he's not a real highly regarded person. Oh, and boy. He said, and he says, I don't think he's going to be able to get it published for you. He said, let me look at your book and I'll tell you if it has any value. So I gave him the draft and he came back the next week. He says, this is really excellent. This is richly deserving of being published. He says, I tell you what to do. You tell your agent that if he agrees to stop representing you, you'll still give him 10% of the royalties. You'll honor the contract, and that you've decided to represent yourself. And tell him the last thing to do is to tell those 6 publishers that they have 10 days to make a decision to accept or reject the book. And if they don't act in 10 days, you'll withdraw the manuscript. He says, that'll get some action. So I said, this sounds great. So I told my agent, and he says, no, that's suicide. He says, you're just, cutting your feet off if you do that. That's the most stupid strategy. It will not work. And I said, I don't care. You tell them they've got 10 days, and then I'll honor my contract. So he says, okay, but you're making a huge mistake. So he told them, and I waited 10 days, and not a thing happened. And it was Friday of the 10th day, and I was about to go home. It was 5 o'clock, and I had one phone number of one of the publishers that he'd given me. And I called this woman, well, the publisher, and the owner of this company picked up the phone. And she said, oh, Dr. Burns. I said, this is Dr. Burns. This is the 10th day, and I was just wondering if you had a chance to act on the manuscript. And she said, I owe you an apology. Your rejection letter is in the typewriter, and we just didn't have time to finish it, but we'll send it to you on Monday.
You're like, you can keep it. Thank you.
Yeah, right. And I'm thinking, oh, this is my big chance. At least I'm being rejected. That's a step forward. And so I use these things. I teach therapists, and sometimes my patients call the 5 secrets of effective communication. And so I decided to try it out. And I said, oh, listen, I've heard such great things about you, and I don't want to tie you up on a Friday when you're heading home, but maybe could you tell me why you decided to reject it? And she said, yes, to tell you the truth, it's an incredibly boring book and no one would be interested in it. Your writing is like a clumsy academic. And then I decided to use like stroking and the disarming technique. Mm-hmm. So it says, you're absolutely right. And I've heard such awesome things about you. I have a colleague who has a book with you, and he's been telling me what a wonderful person you are. Actually, he was telling me the opposite, but I didn't want to say that. He said she was very difficult. But I said he's been singing your praises, and I think the book is potentially a bestseller. But I would have to work with somebody like you who could show me how to popularize it, because it has a tremendous potential. But you would have the secret to, how to make it really a big hit. And she said, oh, so-and-so was singing my praises. I didn't know that. She said, well, would you be willing to consider a ghostwriter? Now, in my mind, I was thinking, ghostwriter, that sounds like living death. So I told her, yes, a ghostwriter. That would be the most wonderful dream come true. And I said, you probably know the best ghostwriters in New York. And she said, oh, I do. I'll have one of them contact you this weekend, and I want you to get on a train to New York. And Monday, I'm going to give you $10,000 and a contract for this book. And it was so interesting because it was so subjective. And I said, that's great. We have to start the bidding somewhere. And I'm so honored to have this chance to work with you. And then this ghostwriter called me on the weekend, and we kind of brainstormed. And then on Monday, I called 2 of the other publishers that I was able then to get their phone numbers. And I called HarperCollins, or it was called Harper Row at the time, I think. And I got a secretary, and I said, listen, I just wanted to, I'm Dr. Burns. I sent you this manuscript called Mood Therapy. And you had 10 days to send it back, but I want to let you know that it's not crucial because I actually have a publisher now who's made an offer. And the secretary said, oh, someone's made an offer on your book? You hold on, let me get our chief editor on the phone. And then she got on the phone. She said, what book? What offer? And I said, well, I sent you this manuscript, Mood Therapy, and you had 10 days to make a decision, and now someone else is bidding on it. And so I just need you to send it back to me. And she said, oh, well, who's bidding on it? It must be a little academic publisher. And I said, no, it's one of your main competitors. She says, who? And I said, it's confidential. I'm not permitted to reveal that. And she said, how much are they offering? And I said, 10,000, which in those days, by the way, this is 1970 something. It was huge to my way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And she says, don't you sign that contract. We're offering 25,000.
Oh, wow.
And she hadn't even read it.
Wow.
And I said, well, thank you. That's a great offer. Let me get back to you a little later in the day. And then the agent had said the best person was Maria Guarnaschelli at William Morrow. She said, she's a young editor. She's hungry. She knows what to do with your book. So I called Maria, got her on the phone. I said, Maria, Friday was the deadline for this book. You don't need to worry. I have 2 of your competitors in a bidding war. And she said, well, who? I said, well, one of them is HarperCollins, so-and-so at HarperCollins. And she said, well, that was my boss until 3 weeks ago. I just moved to William Morrow and Company. I'm not going to let her beat me out on a book. How much is she offering? I said, 25,000. And she said, you hold the phone. I'm going to go talk to the hospital, to the president of our company. And then she came back and she said, we're going to ask you to make we're going to make a preemptive bid. Now, a preemptive bid means that once we bid, you can't let them bid against us. How much would we have to pay to close the deal right now? And I said, well, and I didn't know what to say. So I said, 35,000. And she says, sold. You come up, get on a train, come up to New York tomorrow morning, and we're going to sign the contract, give you $35,000. Wow. And that's how I got the book published, and none of them had read it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That is quite the origin story. Sometimes when a work is seminal, the way this one is, we kind of think, oh, I'm sure this person had no problem getting this published. But you went on an epic adventure to get this published.
And then after it came out, Maria called me and she said, David, I have to tell you something, that we didn't pay enough for your book. $35,000 was a very small advance. And most of our authors, we have to pay much bigger advances. And so the president creates what he calls the loser list. And that's all the books. Nine out of 10 of our books lose money. And so we put the ones that are going to lose money on a list, and yours is number one on the loser list. And what that means is that the company will do nothing to support your marketing or advertising. You're going to have to do everything on your own. And we sent your book to 10 magazines for serial rights, so they take a chapter and publish it, like in Ladies' Home Journal or Self Magazine or Reader's Digest or some such thing. And she said they all rejected it. And so my last thing is, I'm going to give you the names of the people at these 10 magazines and their phone numbers, and you have to call them up and get them to change their mind.
Oh, wow.
And so I started calling, and my heart was broken. I would call Ladies' Home Journal and Cosmopolitan and get a secretary on the line, and I would say, I'm Dr. Burns, and I have this book, Feeling Good, and I'd like you to take a chapter and put it in your magazine. And then they would say things like, we consider this to be phone harassment.
Oh, my goodness.
We've rejected your book. And it is highly irregular for authors to call and whine and complain. Please do not call us again.
Wow. Oh, my goodness.
I got 10 of those in a row. Oh. And then I went home that night, and I was feeling pretty dejected, and I told my wife, Melanie, I said, Melanie, we have to celebrate tonight. And she said, oh, great, what happened? I said, I was rejected by every magazine to put an excerpt of my book in it, and the publisher has decided not to support the book in any way. And she said, so why would we celebrate? I said, well, anyone can celebrate when you've had a success. When you're getting screwed over, when you're failing, that's when you need to celebrate, to give yourself some warmth and support, because I'm going to make that book a success. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but let's just celebrate and believe that something great is eventually going to happen.
Wow.
So anyway, that's how the book came out. There was nothing easy about it. Mm-hmm. And then it was 8 years of being rejected by television shows and radio shows. And finally, I got a break. I got a chance to be on the old Phil Donahue show. It was like the forerunner of the Oprah show. Mm-hmm. And it was a fantastic show. And the book had sold out, and they'd reprint 3,000 and sell out and print a couple thousand more. But the publisher never caught on that it had potential. And at the end of that Phil Donahue show in 1988, within 5 minutes, it went to the #1 position on every bestseller list.
Wow.
And that's how the thing really became popular.
Incredible. I love that story. That is fantastic. And I appreciate you sharing it, because I think that, especially in the social media age, it's very easy to feel like everyone else is having it easier than we are. And, you know, it just takes a lot of effort and tenacity and determination to get anything done, especially if it's worthwhile. So that's fantastic. Before we talk about some of the stuff in the book, I have a question for you about therapists. One thing that is happening is that a lot of people, especially people who maybe for cultural or financial reasons have never considered therapy before, are starting to understand its value and see it as an avenue for healing and personal progress and managing trauma. And so I'm curious about your advice to someone who might be looking for a therapist and is not sure what questions to ask or what to look for in figuring out whether it's the right fit.
You know, I tend to be a bit cynical, and I think a lot of what goes on in psychotherapy in the United States is, this will sound harsh, but I think a lot of it just schmoozing behind closed doors with the occasional bit of advice thrown in. And to me, that's not really really psychotherapy or just kind of long-term tell me more and venting and getting the feelings out. And that's the kind of therapy I was trained in as a psychiatric resident at University of Pennsylvania. And I never saw anyone recover with that kind of therapy. And so if you're struggling with depression and anxiety, and you'd like to recover, I would ask the therapist, do you get high-speed results, or would you be offering some kind of long-term thing that goes on for months or years of, general talk? When Feeling Good came out, cognitive therapy was brand new, and it was a high-speed treatment for depression and anxiety, and I saw most of my patients recovering in maybe 12 to 15 sessions. Now in my group at Stanford, we have a new spin on cognitive therapy, a new high-speed form of cognitive therapy where in my own work, I typically will see a complete elimination of symptoms the first time I sit down with a patient. I'll typically have a 2-hour session because I treat people for free now, so I don't care how long it goes on. But my attempt is more or less, it's a bad word for therapists, but I try to cure the patient in one session, and then you have to do relapse prevention training, which takes about 30 minutes. But the point I'm trying to make is we're focused on high speed, total elimination of symptoms. We can't always do it, but I see it most of the time, and so I say if my daughter was going to a therapist and the therapist said, I can get you better here in just a few sessions, get your symptoms to disappear, get you back to self-esteem and joy, I would kiss that person's feet. And if they said, I'm going to be talking to your daughter for years and years, it would churn my stomach. I think it's like the treatment of pneumonia. We want intravenous penicillin so we can recover in a matter of a few days. People don't want to be having endless talk therapy for pneumonia. They want to recover, and so I would say that's an important thing. And if the therapist can't really tell you that he or she sees rapid recovery with most of the patients, then I wouldn't want to go to that person. Now, there are exceptions, of course. If someone has a serious brain disorder like schizophrenia and they're hallucinating and paranoid, that's not a quick cure or quick recovery, sadly. But for the vast majority of people struggling with depression and all of the anxiety disorders, the prognosis now, using the new techniques, the prognosis for rapid recovery is very strong. But you've got to find a therapist who has a green thumb, a therapist who can really help people recover. Mm-hmm. One other thing is we measure symptoms at the beginning and end of every therapy session with little brief scales the patients take in the waiting room before the session starts and after the session is over. And it shows exactly how depressed they are, exactly how anxious they are right now. And so we can see with ultimate certainty if we're getting that dramatic reduction in symptoms within the therapy session. And I would ask the therapist too, do you measure things or do you just rely on your own intuition as to how your patients are getting better? Because I've done research at the Stanford Hospital on the accuracy of therapists to know how your patient feels. And the accuracy sucks. Even the world's finest experts on psychiatric interviewing, if you ask them, how depressed do you think this patient is right now at this moment? And then the patient fills out a scale to assess it, and the expert fills out a scale guessing how depressed the patient is, the accuracy is less than 10%.
Wow.
The accuracy on detecting suicidal urges is 0%.
Wow.
The accuracy on detecting anger is 0%. And so we feel you cannot do good therapy without using quantitative assessment tests at every single session to track progress. And that's getting more popular. I think I was the first person in the world to start doing this. I've been demanding my patients take at least one psychological test every session since I started psychotherapy in the mid to late 1970s. But hardly anyone was doing it. People thought, this is not worth doing. But it's going to transform psychology and psychotherapy, because you can see for the first time how you're really doing within a single session. It's like having an emotional x-ray machine. And And I think it will soon be required in the United States. I think that the day that for therapists just do whatever they want behind closed doors and string people along endlessly without documented changes in symptoms is coming to an end. Insurance policies are going to demand accountability. Patients are going to demand accountability. And I think it's going to be a very healthy change for this wild West thing called psychotherapy that's right now just kind of totally unregulated. I think there's over 1,000 schools of psychotherapy in the United States, and people make up a new one practically every 2 or 3 weeks, and it's not, sadly, it's not very scientific.
Wow. No, that's super helpful, because I think sometimes people might be a bit intimidated in having these conversations. But at the end of the day, no different than a physician to help you, like you were saying, recover from pneumonia or some other condition. You would ask intelligent questions to be sure this person was the right fit. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, these conversations are intimidating for the therapist too. When I get feedback, I get feedback sometimes that shows that what I thought went on in the session was just way in left field. And I've had times I thought I just had a great session, and the patient gave me horrible feedback on the empathy scale, the helpfulness scale, and then I have to talk it over with them the next time and say, it sounds like I screwed up, and I didn't even know it. Tell me what turned you off, and then we talk it over and get back on the same page and have a terrific session. But it's painful for the therapist too to have these sessions because you often find out that things are not the way you thought they were. But then you're in a position to change it, to correct it.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of your strategies and tools. One of my absolute favorites, which I only recently discovered via your podcast, was this idea of taking a negative thought or feeling and asking yourself what's good about it and what it says about your core values. Am I articulating that correctly?
Absolutely. This is one of the newest and most radical developments that's come out of my training group at Stanford, and it's a radical departure from cognitive therapy, which is based on correcting the distortions in your negative thoughts, and those tools are still amazingly powerful and helpful. They're like pure gold, but the new techniques help reduce patients' resistance to change. It turns out that people who do not rapidly recover, if the therapist has good techniques, the slow recovery is almost always due to therapeutic resistance. And so I've developed techniques to quickly reduce or completely eliminate therapeutic resistance. And one of the most amazing ones is what I call positive reframing. And we have the patient begin to look at what's positive and awesome about their negative thoughts and feelings. There was a woman who had 3 decades of abuse from her pretty sociopathic husband. He raped her, he beat her, and he told her if she ever tried to leave him, he would kidnap the children and take them to South America, and she'd never see them again. And he was very wealthy and had a lot of money, and she believed he would do that. So she put up with these beatings, and she would try to stifle her screams so the children wouldn't hear. She later found out they did know what was going on, but it was a very sad thing. And so she'd had, decades of failed treatment for her depression. At the time I saw her, she had finally gotten divorced from her ex, but she was still in a state of intense anxiety, intense rage, and intense depression. And one of her thoughts was, I must be defective. That was why he beat me. He saw that I was a defective human being. And that thought contained tons of distortions. But before I helped her crush her negative thoughts, I said, let's look at what these negative thoughts and feelings show about you that's positive and awesome. And this was just something she couldn't grasp at first, because we've been taught to be ashamed of our depression and anxieties due to a chemical imbalance in your brain or a defective childhood, or it's a disorder. The DSM calls them mental disorders, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And when you think about that's kind of a put down, and it's kind of shame producing, and puts the patient in this inferior position to the expert therapist who's going to correct your brain chemistry or correct your defective personality or whatever. And we're going in the opposite direction. And what is the fact that you say you must be defective? What does that thought show about you that's positive and awesome? You're intensely panicky and anxious. What are some really great things about being anxious? Can you think of any?
Well, I think that on some level it shows that you care deeply about what's happening in your life or around you.
Well, that's certainly a good one. Her depression shows her great passion for what she's lost, the decades that she's lost. And her sadness and depression, in a way, are appropriate. Can you imagine? I say, suppose we have a magic button and you press it, you'll be instantly cured with no effort. Would you press it? And she said, oh, absolutely, I'd press it. I'd say, well, before you press, I said, I got some great tools, and you may walk out of this session with all your symptoms gone. In fact, I predict you will. But before we use these tools, let's see if you really want to do that. Now, think about your depression. If you press the magic button, you'll go into a state of instant euphoria. Does that make sense? You want to say, oh, I've been beaten and raped for 30 years, and I'm as happy as can be. You see, it makes no sense at all. Your depression is totally understandable, something to honor, not something to be ashamed of. And your anxiety, can you think of some good things about that? And she said, well, my husband still lives in the same town. He's still dangerous. Maybe it protects me, my anxiety. And this guy's been flirting with me recently. He seems like a good guy, but maybe I need some anxiety so I don't get into the same kind of relationship again. I said, you're right. Your anxiety is a form of self-love. You see, you don't want to press a magic button and have your anxiety disappear. And then look at your criticisms, your self-criticisms. I must be defective. What does that show about you that's beautiful and awesome? She says, well, my self-criticism shows I have high standards. So I said, add that to the list. Absolutely, you've got high standards. Have they motivated you? She said, oh, yes, after I got divorced, I got a PhD in clinical psychology, and now I've got a booming practice, one of the biggest in my city, helping abuse victims.
Wow.
And I said, well, that's mind-blowing. And on and on and on. And we came up with this list of 21 fabulous things that her negative thoughts and feelings revealed about her. And then I said, well, gosh, given all that, it's not such a good idea to press that magic button. But what we could do, let's say we have a magic dial. Instead of making all these, your shame disappear and your depression disappear and your rage disappear. And after all, her rage, that's a pretty good thing, too. She's got a lot to be enraged about. Maybe we could dial them down to a lower level. How much depression would you like to have at the end of the evening? And she said, oh, 10% would be good enough. She'd estimated it at 100% at the start of the demonstration. And then your anxiety is 100%. How much anxiety would you need to keep yourself safe? She said, oh, 5 would be plenty of anxiety. So I suggested she dial everything down. And so then at that point, then I said, okay, now let's go ahead and I'll reduce these feelings to these levels. Now, you have to be careful because the techniques I'm going to use are so powerful, like your shame may go all the way to 0, and your depression may go all the way to 0, or your anxiety may go all the way to 0. But don't worry, if you get too free of depression, too free of anxiety, I'll help you get a little anxious and depressed before the end of the session. Then she just started laughing, and then I knew I had her. And then we just blew her negative thoughts out of the water, and at the end of the session, and it took about an hour and a half to do this. You can do it in typical, 50-minute hour once a week if you want. I just like to do it all at once because then the treatment is done. And she was, everything went to 0, but you'd say it went below 0 because she just went into a state of euphoria. And that was after 38 years of failed treatment for depression. And so it's just, I feel like we have magic at my fingertips now, and I'm writing about it. I'm working on a new book, kind of the sequel to Feeling Good. I'm going to call it Feeling Great. My publishers wanted me to revise Feeling Good, and I looked at it, and it's too beautifully written. It's all tied. It's all intermeshed together. It's like a complex fabric, and to pull the strands apart and reweave it seem like a horrible thing to do, because the book is still helping people. It's still effective, and I'm instead just writing a new book. And if I can do a little self promo,
Sure.
which of course I would never do, although having just done it, my website is feelinggood.com. I've got tons of free resources there. You mentioned the Feeling Good podcasts come out every Monday, and there's a lot of resources there for therapists and for patients and the general public who want to learn about some of these, what I think are very exciting new techniques. But I think it's never been a more exciting time in psychotherapy. The cognitive revolution that we initiated in the 1970s, I think in part because of my book, cognitive therapy went from being an unknown form of thought of as a form of quackery. It's now the most widely used form of psychotherapy in the world, and the most researched school of psychotherapy in history. But now I think with these new motivational techniques to enhance the cognitive therapy, I think we're on the verge of a second revolution in psychotherapy that's going to make, and already has made, super rapid recovery available for the majority of people struggling with depression and anxiety.
I, through reading your work, especially the chapter on your work is not your worth, I had a light bulb moment that I am a recovering perfectionist.
Oh, yeah, me too.
I would love to get your thoughts on, how you guide your patients and your readers through kind of untangling their identity and self-worth from being perfect and doing everything right and having everything be right.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you how it worked for me, and that I had the same issue that you've got. And early in my career, I was walking down the street with a colleague. I remember him once saying when we were walking that he said, "I feel sorry for these therapists who think they've got to be able to cure everybody." He said, "It's just so ridiculous." And I said, "Yeah, John, you're right. That's really ridiculous." But in my brain, I was thinking, well, John, it's only ridiculous if you're not a great therapist. But if you're someone like me, it's okay, because I am going to cure every one of my patients. And that's that perfectionism. And it's addictive because it excited me. It made me think somehow I was going to be one cut above. Mm-hmm. And there was some benefit to it because when I got stuck with a patient, I would invent more and more techniques. I thought if I have enough techniques, I'll find the one that can cure every patient. But the problem was that when patients were resisting and saying, "David, you can't help me," or "Dr. Burns, you can't help me," it threatened my self-esteem. And it upset me and frustrated me. And so I'd kind of get into a power struggle trying to prove to these patients that I could help them and that their hopelessness was not realistic. And then they defended themselves, and so it didn't always go in a good direction. And then one day I got to thinking about self-acceptance, and I had a patient who said, "Dr. Burns, you haven't been helping me." And I responded differently, and I said, you're right, and it bothers me too, because your depression has not been improving, and I feel kind of ashamed, especially because I like you so much, and on some level I'm convinced that we could do good work or great work, and I've been totally missing the boat. I can imagine you feel angry and disappointed and discouraged, and tell me about that. This conversation could get us back on the same page to where we could really work together. And then the patients opened up and they spilled their hearts out, and we began to connect, and all of a sudden they started recovering. And the paradox was when I accepted my imperfection, my humanness, it somehow gave me greater power to connect with people. And it's just been a fantastic thing, and I call that one of the deaths of the ego. There's 4 deaths of the ego involved in recovery from depression versus anxiety versus relationship problems versus habits and addictions. But the recovery from perfectionism and depression and a lot of anxiety is the death of the self, accepting the fact that you're really kind of average at best, and not being ashamed of it, and suddenly welcoming with joy the banquet of just being alive. And it's a spiritual thing. It's also a psychological thing. I was out jogging the other day. The mailman came to the door. He says, "Oh, doctor, good. That's great. I saw you out walking." And I wanted to kill the guy. I wanted to say, "I wasn't walking, darn it. I was jogging and damn fast." and then I ran into a neighbor. No, a guy was bicycling past, and I was out jogging, and he shouted at me, "Good to see you out walking." So I've had to accept the fact I'm not even average anymore. I used to be able to run like 7-minute miles for pretty long distances, and now I can come down the 5 percentile. I'm everybody. An elderly woman hobbling with a cane zoomed past me the other day. So I've had to accept that I'm not even average in a lot of ways anymore. But when you accept yourself without shame and without beating up on yourself, life becomes a beautiful thing. We adopted a little kitty that a neighbor gave us. It was a stranded kitty. They found her in a rainstorm. She was only 3.5 weeks old, and she was right by this busy street near our house. I called her Miss Misty, and yesterday after my Sunday hike, I just sat down and kind of fell asleep on the bed. When I woke up, she was lying right next to me, kind of on her back. I started stroking her tummy, and so she rolled over entirely on her back and stretched all of her legs and feet out, so I'd have total access to her tummy. I just started petting her and just putting my hand on her tummy, and I left my hand there for about 40 minutes. And she was just squeaking the whole time with just total glee and joy. And I thought, man, this is the best. She's just an average little cat, like a stray cat. She's not a show cat. There's nothing. She's not a purebred. We used to call them alley cats when I was growing up in Denver, and they'd live in the alley and get food out of the trash cans. And I'm just like an old guy now, an old fart. And she's not special, and I'm not special. But boy, life becomes special when you no longer have to be special. Like, it doesn't get any better than that. And that's, I think, the sad thing about depression and perfectionism. We're kind of beating up on ourselves, thinking if we criticize ourselves enough, I'm a loser, or I'll never get better, I'm a worthless human being, I've never accomplished anything special. That somehow something good will come out of that inner dialogue. But all that ever comes out of that kind of demandingness and perfectionism and self-criticism is agony and pain, and sometimes even suicide. And so yes, that's one of many keys, traps we get into, perfectionism, thinking we're going to be so great. And I found that people love me way more, when I'm flawed, when I fail, when I share that I'm feeling down, or I share that I made a mistake in teaching and felt kind of ashamed of it, and point out to the students the error that I made. It's the oddest thing. They just seem to warm up and feel so close, and it's just a magical thing to discover. And I'm so glad that you had that as well, as a result of reading part of that and feeling good. That was what I was hoping when I wrote it, but I never knew initially, if it would work for anyone to write a book and then someone could read it and have a positive effect on their life. And it just music to my ears when I hear that.
Yes, it's amazing, because oftentimes what we're wrestling with is the fact that we don't have a name for something. And when someone comes along and describes the exact thing and says, here's a name we can give it, so we can figure out what to do with it and where to put it and how to process it, it just makes you feel so much less alone with all
Yeah.
of your neuroses and
Oh, yeah.
quirks.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people don't even know they're depressed. See,
Right.
they don't have that name for it. They just think, oh, I'm just an inferior human being.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
just a kind of a hopeless case. My problems will never be solved. Life sucks. I have a bad life, and it's inevitable. And then when you discover that you have depression and that there are powerful and now drug-free techniques to bust out of depression, get back to joy and self-esteem, it's pretty mind-blowing for people, although most people with depression, people listening right now, don't believe it. They don't realize that they can't accept the fact. It seems so impossible that they could really recover and get back to joy and self-esteem. And that's one of the really cool things about having effective treatment techniques. It just blows people's minds when they recover, especially when they recover really fast. And then that touches me, the therapist, as much as it touches the patient. So when the patient goes into a euphoric state, I go into a euphoric state as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I do hope that listeners who are struggling with these things will pick up Feeling Good and check out the site, which will be in the show notes, because it has been immensely helpful to me personally. And I am a living testimony that, you can come back from some very, very dark days and low points and feel better and develop your own rubric and your own set of tools that can get you to a good place when you need them.
Well, I appreciate that. And I've been narcissistically talking about myself. You've obviously done some fantastic things, have a magnificent podcast that, I don't know how you've gotten so much success. And I just have tremendous admiration for what you're doing. It's tremendous.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I have two questions for you before we wrap. The first is about books. Other than your own, these can be fiction or non, new or old, things you personally love, or books you think everyone should read. Are there any you suggest?
Well, I loved, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. It changed my life, but people won't be able to understand it. Although it's written in little words about simple things, you won't be able to get it. But I do have a book I'd recommend if you want to find out about Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I cry uncontrollably every time I read it, and it's real short. And it's Ludwig Wittgenstein, a memoir. It was written by his favorite student, Norman Malcolm, and it talks about his pretty tortured life. He had a very sad life and struggled with intense depression. And he had three brothers who all committed suicide. And he was an incredibly lonely person because he went in and out of severe depressions because sometimes he sensed that he was on to probably the greatest breakthrough in the history of philosophy, and that would be my opinion, that he's the greatest philosopher of all time. But he was intensely lonely because no one could seem to get what he was trying to say, and yet it was so simple. I think the Buddha had the same problem. He was trying to say something very, very simple that no one could get. When the Buddha, they said he had over 100,000 followers and only 3 experienced enlightenment. And so wow. I think the Buddha was frustrated too. And what he was trying to say was simple, and in a way the same thing that Wittgenstein was trying to say. But that's a little book you can get it, and it's just very moving, and it's just beautiful. It's less than 100 pages, and they're small pages, but it's just filled with emotion, and that one I loved. And then when I was in college, I used to think that Emily Dickinson was kind of a silly poet for like Easter cards or birthday cards, silly little verses. And then I had a lecture, because she lived in Amherst, where the college was, and a professor gave a lecture on her poetry and showed how complex and mind-blowing it was, and kind of mystical, that her theme was you can only gain something if you've lost it. And her life was one of loss on every level. And then I saw it, and I kind of fell in love with her poetry, and I bought the books that had all of her drafts and of all of her poems, and I loved that. And we used to go and visit her grave. Those are my two favorite books.
Love it. Those are great recommendations. The last question is, what is behind your brilliance? What do you attribute your success and creativity to?
I would give it in part some credit to Amherst College, because they really taught critical thinking, not to be gullible, not to believe what you read, how to see through things. And I think that's been helpful to me, because, for example, when I was a psychiatric resident, my supervisors were psychoanalysts, and they told me to say to my patients, "Tell me more." And I was only allowed to say that twice in a session. I could only utter 2 sentences in each session. And then I could motion with my hands, too. They said, if you want the patient to say more. And the patients would come in for sessions, and they would sob and cry and be angry. And they say, "Dr. Burns, you're not helping me with my depression or with my marriage." And I would say, "Tell me more." And they'd say, "All you ever say is tell me more." And then by that point, my 2 tell me mores were used up. So I'd motion with my hands, like, keep talking. They'd say, "Now you're jiggling your hands again." And it didn't make sense to me that this was effective therapy. And I would say to my supervisors, "Where does the cure come?" I mean, I've been working with this patient 9 months, and they're the same today as the first day they came. And my supervisors would never answer that question, because they were believing in something occult. I don't mean to be so disrespectful, but to me, they'd kind of joined a cult, a psychoanalytic cult. Mm-hmm. And they weren't thinking critically. I saw the same thing in psychopharmacology. I was doing brain research. Our research at Penn showed that the idea that depression is due to a chemical imbalance in the brain is not true. That's a false theory, and we showed that in the mid-1970s and published it in the top psychiatric journal. But people kept believing it because it was the thing to do, and because it generates monies for psychiatrists who can write prescriptions and drug companies who can push antidepressants. But I knew back then that the drugs I was giving to depressed patients seemed to have little or no effect other than a placebo effect. And then only in the last 5 or 10 years have researchers, Irving Kirsch at Harvard and others, have gone into the Food and Drug Administration, reanalyzed all the data on antidepressants, and have come to the same conclusion, that they have few or no true antidepressant effects above and beyond their placebo effects. Yeah. And so for me, I think the critical thinking that I got at Amherst was really helpful for me. So that's one reason I left a full-time career doing brain research on this chemical imbalance theory. I had a 5-year grant from the federal government to create a brain serotonin laboratory at Penn, and I had a full-time tenured track position. But my critical thinking says, no, you don't want to do this, because this isn't a valid theory. It's never going to bear fruit. There is some cause of depression, but we don't know what it is yet. And the psychotherapy, David, that you've learned sucks. So let's try to find something new, something different. And so I think that I would, really, really thank Amherst College for critical thinking. And I think it's something that's lacking in the world and needed in the world is more critical thinking.
Completely agree. Could not agree more. I love it. David, you've been an incredible guest. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was just awesome. Best to you and all of you who are listening. Thank you for hearing my message.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.